Well, it's starting to smell like September again in California. We have pretty smoky conditions out there right now. In the Bay Area and the Central Coast, we have unhealthy to even hazardous air quality. It's not actually because of any fires that are happening over the Bay Area or Central Coast. It's fires that are up in the way northwestern parts of California, and then even some smoke coming down from Oregon. And what happened was the northerly winds blew that smoke down throughout the day today. And then the reason your air quality will sometimes be worse at nighttime or in the early mornings than it is in the peak of the afternoon, at least in terms of how much you smell the smoke and maybe how difficult it is to breathe. It's the reason it's bad overnight and in the morning is because the smoke gets blown in during the afternoon when the winds are strongest, but then it's usually still at a pretty high altitude. And then once the winds calm down overnight, that smoke settles down to the surface. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. And with a fire weather watch in place, we'll have to keep an eye on fire conditions over the next couple of days. And with the dry air coming in, windy conditions coming in, and with the northerly winds, there's a good chance that more smoke gets blown in over the next couple days. So we'll keep an eye on that. But I thought it was just an interesting example and story to go into to explain why your air quality with wildfires will actually be worse at the time of the day when the wildfire itself is sometimes not at its peak activity. So smoke worst in the morning, wildfire activity worse in the afternoon. So thought that was interesting, but I also was just reading more of the textbook that I'm going through, Fire in California's Ecosystems, and right now I'm reading chapter 1. It's about fire and California vegetation. And a good place to start out is it goes into the different bioregions of California. And that is something that makes California a pretty amazing place, is how diverse our landscapes are. Up in the northwestern parts of the state, we have mist-shrouded mountains. We have my favorite, the coastlines in California, which have fog in the morning, some beautiful sunshine in the afternoon. We have the Central Valley, which is mostly almost like an alluvial fan, I believe it's called, which is just perfect, fertile soil for crops. We have the Sierra, which picks up large amounts of snow. And then in the southeastern parts of the state, we have desert conditions. So we have a little bit of everything in California. And there's actually 9 bioregions. This is something that I sort of knew but didn't actually know is a distinct 9. And you could try to name them right now, see if you know them, but I'll just give them away. So the first 3 are pretty easy. You have North Coast, Central Coast, South Coast. So keeping a tally here, that's 3. And then everybody knows the Central Valley, and then the Sierra Nevada. So that gives us up to 5. And then, I already mentioned this, but think about Death Valley. You have your southeastern deserts. That's where you have a little bit of the rain shadow effect happening from the Sierra Nevada. So you have very dry, hot conditions there, and it's very low elevation. And then we have 3 more, and those are going to be at the very top of the state. So we'll go from west to east. You have the Klamath Mountains, which is just a number of mountain ranges that have very diverse flora. And then you have the Southern Cascades and the Northeastern Plateau. So those are on the very middle top of California, and then the northeastern section of California. And that's mostly tall volcanoes and old lava flows. So we have all of these different regions in California. And these aren't static. They change throughout time, usually over very large time scales. Your mountains will get lifted up, like we saw mostly, I believe, around 7 million years ago. Sierra Nevada really started rising up. And then, so geology can change. Your climate can also change. 15 million to 17 million years ago, it was the hottest time it's been in the last 23 million years. And then from 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago, we had ice ages. And then luckily over the last 10,000 years, things have been pretty level. So your vegetation and your bioregions will often dance with this geology and the climate. But then there's one more factor that gets mixed in with this and can actually have the largest impact out of any of these factors and over the shortest time period, and that's humans. So for California, shows the first people came over from Asia around 12,000 years ago, and these were the Native Americans. Now they did impact the vegetation, and the main way they impacted the vegetation was actually by using fire. So they would use it to kind of promote, they not only lived with fire, but they used it to their advantages. So they would burn around their villages to create almost a protective barrier. They would burn to promote certain crops that they either like to eat, or if they use the materials for things like basket weaving. And then they also used fire in things like warfare and communications and hunting game. But this did alter the landscape in some ways, but it was a relatively stable pattern. So it wasn't lots of change very quickly. It was something that, it was a practice that they had, and then they just kept it up over time. Now things really started to change, and you could say the mid-1800s. That's when a lot of Euro-American settlers came over for the gold rush. And since then, there has been massive change within the vegetation and landscapes of California. We've seen the fertile lands like the Central Valley either be converted to agriculture or urbanized. We've seen a lot of the coastal sage scrub turn into non-native grasses. So that's where you have the introduction of non-native species, which can sometimes take over. And then we've also seen a lot of the conifer forest logged and then replaced with very different kinds of trees, or with very different stand densities with no real historical precedent. I believe that's the right word. So a lot of change over the last 200 years. And then on top of that, so that's a lot of industry right there, and the introduction of non-native species. But then there's also been the impact that these new settlers had with fire. And that was in the early 1900s. There were some big fires in Idaho and Montana that kind of scared everybody, especially the Forest Service. So there was just a policy of fire exclusion. Now how that impacted the bioregions is without fire in these ecosystems that lived with fire for such a long time that they evolved with fire, it kind of throws the ecosystem out of whack. You end up with a lot more fuels than you should have. And then some of these plants actually can't even reproduce without fire. And that was one interesting fact I learned today. About 54% of California's land, the vegetation needs fire to persist. Thought that was pretty interesting. Some of the areas that wouldn't need it obviously would be like cropland, deserts, or anywhere that's urbanized. So that kind of makes a lot of sense. That's where you wouldn't have as much fire, or you wouldn't want fire to happen. But 54% of California, the plants and even some of the animals need fire in order to continue to survive. For some of them, that's literally how they reproduce. Their seeds don't open up until fire comes through. So one way that we've altered things in the last 200 years with fire is through fire exclusion, but then also with fire ignitions. So wherever you have a large amount of people, you're also going to have more fires popping up. And about 90% of fires today are started by humans. And then that's going to drastically change the natural fire frequency. So for example, Central Coast chaparral that would have the lowest amount of lightning strikes in the United States. That's for the Central Coast. So they'd maybe have fires come through the chaparral every, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. But then you move a bunch of people close to the chaparral, so into the wildland-urban interface, and they're tossing cigarettes, they're dragging chains behind their cars, they're starting fires. And now all of a sudden these plants that kind of evolved with fire and maybe have systems built into the plant themselves that is at a 50-year time scale, all of a sudden there's fires popping up every 5 years, and the plants aren't able to adapt fast enough. And I think that's the main point I'm trying to make here is the change in vegetation for a number of reasons has been much faster in the last 200 years. There's been more change in the last 200 years than there was in the previous 3,000 years. Not only within the vegetation, but within the frequency and intensity of fire. So kind of a main idea that I'm putting forward through all these videos is just how interconnected everything is, and how climate, geology, fire, people, vegetation, I don't know if I already said that one, but it all interacts with each other in a very complex way. So with complex kind of mechanisms and complex ideas. If there's complex problems, your solutions have to be complex as well. What's true for the Central Coast might be very different for the Sierra, which is different for the policies you'd want to have in Southern California. And I'm personally just curious to investigate all of this nuance even more, not only because I think it's interesting, but also because I think it can be very helpful to California if we do expand our knowledge on this very interesting subject. So if you want to learn more as well, you can come along on this journey with me, and thanks for watching.